Sometimes a single night can turn many people's lives upside down, destroy families, and leave scars that will never heal. This story began long before that night, but it was that night that became the point of no return. The steel gates of the Michigan State Prison opened on a cold March morning, releasing a man who had spent 6 years of his life behind bars. Steve Cole stood on the threshold, clutching a plastic bag with a few belongings in his hands, squinting in the unusually bright light. 38 years, 6 of which were behind bars. For armed robbery of a gas station, committed in a fit of despair and stupidity when he ran out of money and couldn't find a job. The wind flapped his jacket, the same one he had worn when he arrived here 6 years ago. It hung loosely on him because during his years in prison, Steve had lost weight and become wiry and angular. His face had become rough, his hair had turned gray, and his eyes had that special alertness that prison leaves in everyone who crosses its threshold. A battered blue sedan was parked at the side of the road, and Steve felt something warm stir in his chest. Jamal Preston leaned against the hood, his arms crossed over his chest, smiling broadly. They had been friends since childhood, growing up on the same street, and Jamal was the only one who hadn't turned away when Steve was sent to prison. The only one who wrote letters, came to visit, and promised to meet him on the day of his release. "Brother." Jamal stepped forward and hugged his friend tightly. "You're free. Finally free." Steve didn't immediately respond to the embrace. 6 years behind bars had taught him to avoid simple human gestures. But then his arms rose of their own accord, and he squeezed Jamal's shoulders, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. "Let's get out of here," Steve muttered, pulling away and turning his head to hide his emotions. "I'm tired of looking at these walls." They got into the car, and Jamal started the engine. Steve stared silently out the window, watching the prison recede into a gray blur on the horizon. The world outside seemed too bright, too fast, too loud. Cars flashed by on the highway, people hurried about their business, and it all felt so foreign that Steve felt a dull panic rising inside him. "How are you?" Jamal asked, glancing at his friend. How are you feeling?" "Strange," Steve replied honestly. "Everything is so different. It's like I've entered a whole new world." "You'll get used to it," Jamal reassured him. "It just takes time. I've arranged everything as I promised. You'll live with us in LaRonda until you get on your feet. You'll find a job and get your own place." Steve nodded, continuing to stare out the window. Detroit greeted him with familiar sights: crooked houses, boarded-up storefronts, graffiti on the walls. The city hadn't changed, only become more worn, more tired. Jamal's apartment was in an old brick building on the outskirts of town. Jamal's wife, LaRonda, greeted them at the door with a forced smile. Steve could tell right away that she wasn't thrilled to see him. She was beautiful and well-groomed, but her gaze betrayed her obvious displeasure. "Hello, Steve," she said dryly. "Jamal has prepared the sofa in the living room for you." "Thank you for taking me in," Steve replied, feeling awkward. "I won't stay long, I promise." The next few days merged into a strange, unfamiliar routine. Steve woke up on the sofa, listening to Jamal and LaRonda getting ready for work, ate breakfast alone, and wandered aimlessly around the apartment. He tried to watch TV, but the abundance of information, the flashing images, and the endless stream of news gave him a headache. He tried to read but couldn't concentrate. The world outside prison was too chaotic, too intense, and Steve didn't know how to fit into it. In the evenings, he and Jamal would sit in the kitchen, drink beer, and talk. Jamal had been working at the warehouse for 10 years, earning good money, but he was tired. He talked about work, about his neighbors, about how the city had changed. Steve listened and tried to imagine his future. He needed a job, money, a place of his own. He needed a life. "I can talk to Roy, my boss," Jamal suggested one evening. "Maybe they'll take you on at the warehouse. The pay is decent, and the work isn't dusty." "I'd appreciate that," Steve nodded. "I need to get started somehow." Jamal paused, then poured himself another beer and looked at his friend seriously. "Steve, I have something to tell you. About Shaniqua." Steve froze, clutching the bottle. The name, which he hadn't heard aloud in several years, hit him like a punch in the gut. Shaniqua. His Shaniqua. The woman he loved. The woman he had dated for 3 years. The woman with whom he had a daughter. "What about her?" he asked hoarsely. "She's married," Jamal said cautiously, choosing his words carefully. "She married some guy named Tyrone a year after you went to prison. They have their own life, their own family. She took his last name. Amara is now Briggs, too." Steve was silent, digesting the information. He knew Shaniqua wasn't waiting for him. She said it on their first prison visit, coldly and harshly, leaving no illusions. She said she wasn't going to waste the best years of her life waiting for a man who had gone to prison because of his own stupidity. She said Amara needed a father, not a criminal. After that conversation, she never came to visit or wrote, and Steve tried to come to terms with the fact that he had lost her forever. But knowing and hearing are two different things. Finding out that she had a new life, a new husband, that his daughter had a different last name, it hurt, even after all these years. "I understand," Steve finally said. "I didn't expect her to wait." "Steve, listen to me." Jamal leaned closer, looking his friend straight in the eye. "Don't get involved with her. The past is the past. You have a new life now, a new chance. Don't waste it trying to get back what you can't have. Shaniqua is not the woman you remember. She's changed. She's become hard, cynical. She doesn't want to see you, Steve. Trust me." "But Amara is my daughter," Steve said quietly. "She's 12 now. I've missed so many years of her life." "I know, brother," Jamal sighed. "But Amara doesn't even remember you. She was 6 when you went to prison. For her, Tyrone is her father. Don't ruin their lives. Think about the girl." Steve was silent. He understood Jamal's logic, understood that his friend was right, but something inside him resisted, clinging to a faint hope. Amara was his daughter, his flesh and blood, and he couldn't just forget about her. A week after his release, Steve had to undergo a mandatory medical examination, a condition of his parole. Jamal drove him to a clinic on the outskirts of town, an old brick building with peeling paint on the walls and a faded sign. The doctor who saw Steve was an elderly man with gray hair and a tired face. Dr. Kwesi Asante, as the nameplate said, spoke with a slight African accent and looked at Steve without judgment, which was nice. "Have a seat, Mr. Cole," said the doctor, pointing to a chair. "This is standard procedure. We'll take some blood for tests and check your overall health. It's nothing to worry about." Steve nodded and silently rolled up his sleeve. The nurse took his blood, and Dr. Ashanti examined him, asking standard questions about his well-being, chronic illnesses, and complaints. Steve answered in monosyllables, wanting to get it over with and leave. "The results will be ready in a few days," the doctor said at the end of the appointment. "We'll call you. If there are any abnormalities, we'll invite you back for a follow-up appointment." Steve left the clinic without giving it much thought. He was thinking about work, about the future, about how to start his life over. He didn't think that a phone call from the clinic could change everything. The call came 4 days later. Steve was sitting in the living room, mindlessly flipping through channels, when his phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. A woman's voice asked him to come to the clinic for a follow-up appointment, without explaining why. Steve felt something tighten inside. Something was wrong. The next day, he was sitting in Dr. Ashanti's office again. The doctor looked at him seriously, and in his gaze, Steve saw something that made his heart beat faster. "Mr. Cole," the doctor began slowly, "your test results show the presence of antibodies to the human immunodeficiency virus. You have HIV. The world around Steve seemed to freeze. The doctor's words came from somewhere far away, as if through cotton wool. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, an incurable disease, a death sentence with a stay of execution. This is a mistake," Steve said hoarsely. "This can't be true." "I understand your shock," Dr. Asante said calmly, professionally. "But the test was done twice to confirm the result. Unfortunately, it's not a mistake. However, it's important to understand that HIV today is not a death sentence. There is antiretroviral therapy that allows you to live a full life for decades. I will refer you to a specialist who will select a treatment. Steve wasn't listening. He stared at a single point, trying to comprehend what he had heard. HIV. How? When? He remembered the years before prison, remembered Shanikva. They had been together for 3 years, and he had never cheated on her. He had never been with anyone else. So it was Shanikva. She infected him, and then she left him, got married, built a new life, leaving him to die a slow death. Mr. Cole, the doctor's voice brought him back to reality. Can you hear me? We need to start treatment as soon as possible. The sooner, the better the prognosis. Steve nodded mechanically, taking the test results and referral from the doctor's hands. He left the clinic feeling as if he were in a dream. The cold wind whipped his face, but he didn't feel it. He walked down the street, oblivious to the passers-by, the cars, the lights. Inside, he felt empty. Emptiness and a dull, throbbing pain that grew, filling everything. He thought about Shanikva, about what she had done to him, about how she was living her life peacefully while he was slowly dying. And for the first time in many years, Steve felt hatred, pure, burning, all-consuming hatred. Steve spent the next 3 days in a strange stupor. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. The diagnosis played over and over in his head like a broken record. HIV positive, HIV positive, HIV positive. Words that crossed out his future, turned his plans to dust. Jamal tried to talk to him, but Steve responded in monosyllables, unwilling to discuss what was going on inside him. The thought of Shanikva haunted him. She was the only woman in his life before prison, the only one he was close to. So she knew. She knew she was sick and kept quiet. She infected him and left him to rot behind bars without saying a word. The more Steve thought about it, the more his anger grew. He needed to talk to her, to hear the truth from her mouth. On the 4th day, he took out his phone and dialed her number, the number that Jamal had once mentioned in passing, and which Steve had memorized. The phone rang endlessly, and Steve was about to hang up when he heard a familiar voice. Hello? Shanikwa's voice sounded even, without emotion. Steve was momentarily speechless, not knowing where to start. Shanikwa, it's me, Steve. There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line and imagined her standing somewhere, clutching the phone in her hand, deciding whether to hang up or listen. What do you want? She finally asked coldly. I need to talk to you. It's important. Very important. We have nothing to talk about, Steve. I have my life. You have yours. Leave me alone. Shanikwa, please. He heard the plea in his own voice and hated himself for it. This concerns both of us. I need to see you, just once. No, delete my number and don't call me again. She hung up. Steve stared at the phone, feeling a helpless rage boiling up inside him. She didn't even want to listen. She just refused, like you would refuse an annoying beggar. But he wouldn't give up. He would find a way to talk to her. Jamal said that Shanikwa worked as a nurse at a clinic on East Street, the same clinic where Steve had learned of his diagnosis. Irony of fate. The next day, he went there without telling Jamal where he was going. The clinic was small, 2 stories, with peeling walls and the smell of disinfectant. Steve went inside and looked around. An elderly woman sat behind the reception desk and looked at him indifferently. Can I help you? I need to see Shanikwa Briggs, Steve said. Does she work here? Do you have an appointment? No, I just need to talk to her. It's personal. The woman frowned, but something in Steve's face made her decide not to argue. Wait here. She got up and disappeared behind the door. Steve remained standing in the lobby, clenching his fists in his jacket pockets. 5 minutes passed before the door opened again, and he saw her. Shanikwa had hardly changed. Same dark eyes, same sharp cheekbones, same smooth skin. She was wearing a white medical gown, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. But something in her face had changed. It was hard, closed off. She looked at Steve as if he were an unpleasant nuisance she wanted to get rid of as quickly as possible. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply without greeting him. "I need to talk. Let's go somewhere where no one can hear us." Shaniqua pursed her lips in displeasure but nodded. They went out into the clinic's courtyard, overgrown with weeds. It was empty and quiet here. Shaniqua crossed her arms over her chest and looked at Steve expectantly. "Talk. I have 5 minutes." I found out I have HIV, Steve blurted out bluntly, without preamble. "I was diagnosed a week ago." He waited for a reaction. Shock, fear, guilt, anything. But Shaniqua just raised an eyebrow, and a cold smile appeared on her lips. "And what do you want me to say?" "Did you know?" Steve's voice trembled. "Did you know you were sick when we were together?" "I'm not sick, Steve," she said calmly, almost indifferently. "I'm HIV negative. I get tested regularly, as required for medical professionals, so you can keep your accusations to yourself." "You're lying," Steve stepped closer. "I never had anyone before you. No one. So it was you. Only you." Shaniqua smiled, and there was so much contempt in that smile that Steve felt something break inside him. "You spent 6 years in prison, Steve. 6 years among people like you. And you want to tell me you had no entertainment there? That no one touched you? Don't make me laugh. You got what you deserved, that's all." "That's not true," he was almost shouting now. "I didn't." "I don't care," Shaniqua interrupted him coldly. "That's your problem, Steve, not mine. You're the one to blame for what happened to you. You committed a crime, went to prison, and got your reward. Now leave me alone. I don't want anything to do with you." "Amara." Steve grabbed her arm. "I need to see Amara. She's my daughter. I have the right." Shaniqua jerked her arm away and took a step back. Anger flashed in her eyes. "You have no rights. You're nobody to her, understand? Nobody. She doesn't even remember you. She has a father, a real father who cares for her and provides for her. And you're just a criminal who got out of prison. Do you think I'll let you near my daughter? Never. Forget about her. As far as she's concerned, you died the day you went to prison." Every word was like a blow. Steve stood there, feeling a black void growing inside him. Shaniqua looked at him one last time with disgust and turned to leave. "Don't come here anymore," she said over her shoulder. "And don't call me. Otherwise, I'll call the police and say you're stalking me. You don't need that, Steve. You really don't need that." She left, and Steve stood in the courtyard, clenching his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He breathed heavily, trying to control the storm of emotions raging inside him. Hatred, pain, despair. It all mixed into a lump stuck in his throat. He returned to Jamal's apartment late that evening. Jamal was sitting in the kitchen with a bottle of beer and looked up when Steve entered. "Where have you been? I called you 10 times. "Out for a walk," Steve replied curtly as he walked past. "Steve, wait!" Jamal stood up and blocked his way. "What's going on with you? You seem different. You're not even talking to me normally." "Everything's fine." Steve tried to get around his friend, but Jamal wouldn't let him. "Nothing's fine. You lie around all day, don't eat, don't talk to anyone. What happened? Is it because of those tests?" Steve remained silent. He couldn't tell Jamal about the diagnosis. He couldn't say it out loud. Shame and fear prevented him from opening his mouth. "I'm just tired," he finally said. "I need time to recover." Jamal sighed and shook his head. "Listen, brother, I want to help you. I really do. But LaRonda, she's not thrilled about you being here. She says you've been staying with us too long and that it's creating tension. I tried to convince her otherwise, but she insists. Maybe you should look for another place?" Steve looked at his friend and nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll leave." "I'm not kicking you out," Jamal said quickly. "It's just, you understand. Family, wife. I have to think about her too." "I understand." Steve turned and walked to the sofa. "I'll find a place." But he didn't look for a place. He spent the next few days wandering around town, watching. He found out where Shaniqua lived. A small, neat house on a quiet street in a decent neighborhood. He found out what time she came home from work, when her husband left for his shift, when Amara came home from school. He stood apart, hiding around the corner, and looked at the house that could have been his family, his daughter, his life. Jamal called several times, but Steve didn't answer. He didn't know what to say to his friend. He felt something inside him breaking, cracking, falling apart. The world that was supposed to be a new beginning had turned into a series of humiliations and pain. He needed to see Shaniqua again, to talk to her, to explain that he wasn't dangerous, that he just wanted to see his daughter at least once. Just once. Was that too much to ask? He came to her house late in the evening, when the sun had already set and the street was plunged into twilight. He stood at the gate, gathering his courage, when the front door opened and Shaniqua came out onto the porch. She saw him and froze. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was quiet, but full of anger. "I need to talk." Steve stepped closer. "Shaniqua, please. I just want to see Amara. Once. I won't bother her. I won't say anything. Just look at her." Shaniqua descended the porch and approached him. In the light of the street lamp, her face looked like stone. "Don't you understand nicely?" She spoke softly, but every word was filled with venom. "I told you to leave us alone, but you keep crawling around here like some kind of rat. Are you watching us? My house? Do you realize that's stalking?" "I'm not stalking you," Steve began, but she cut him off. "Shut up! Just shut up and listen!" Shaniqua stepped closer, and he saw cold triumph in her eyes. "You think I feel sorry for you? You think I care that you have HIV? I don't give a damn, Steve. You got what you deserved. You're a criminal, a loser who has achieved nothing in life and is now dying of a disease you picked up who knows where. Maybe someone raped you in prison? Maybe you sold yourself there for cigarettes? I don't care. You're a nobody. You've always been a nobody, and now you're a sick nobody." Steve listened, and every word cut into him like a knife. He saw her face, contorted with anger and contempt, and didn't recognize the woman he once loved. "You know what's funny?" Shaniqua smiled. I'm glad you're suffering. I'm glad your life has turned into hell. Because you deserve it. You left me alone with a child when you went to rob that gas station. You only thought about yourself, about your problems. And me? I was left alone, without money, with a little daughter on my hands. I had to survive while you were behind bars, so don't expect any pity from me. I don't have any. I've built a new life, a good life. I have a husband who cares for me. Amara has a father who loves her. And you? You're just a ghost from the past, a sick, dying ghost, dying, and I want you to disappear. Forever. Get out of our lives and don't come back. Understand? No. Come back. She turned and walked toward the house. Steve stood there, unable to move. Something inside him had finally snapped. Something important. Something that had been keeping him on the edge. He stared at Shaniqua's back, and only one word echoed in his head. Hatred. She went into the house and slammed the door. Steve remained standing on the dark street, his fists clenched. There was no more pain inside. There was no despair. There was only cold, calm determination. He knew what he was going to do next. He finally understood. Steve disappeared for 4 days. Jamal called him every day, left messages, but the phone was silent. Jamal even visited several places where Steve might have stayed, but he was nowhere to be found. He seemed to have dissolved into the city, becoming part of its gray streets and abandoned buildings. In fact, Steve had rented a room in a cheap hotel on the outskirts. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and the smell of mold, but he didn't care. He spent his days sitting on a sagging bed and staring at the wall. Inside, there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. Shankiva's words echoed endlessly in his head, eating away at the last remnants of hope. He thought about his life, about how everything had gone wrong, about the moment when he walked into that gas station with a gun in his hand, not realizing that he was ruining his future. At the time, it seemed like there was no way out, that he needed money urgently, that this was the only way. And now he understood that it wasn't a way out, but the beginning of the end. Everything that happened after that, prison, loneliness, illness. It all started that night. But even more, he thought about Shanikva, about her face, distorted with contempt. Her words tore him apart. She was glad to see him suffer, glad to see him die. She laughed at him, humiliated him, trampled on what little he had left. And worst of all, she took his daughter away from him, the only thing that connected him to a normal life, to humanity. On the third day at the hotel, Steve went outside. He walked through familiar neighborhoods where he had once grown up, where he still had old acquaintances, people he no longer wanted to have anything to do with, but who could help with certain things. He found Dexter in a bar on Grand River. Dexter had been dealing weapons even before Steve's arrest and continued to do so now. They didn't talk long. Steve said he needed protection, that the streets were dangerous for someone who had just gotten out of prison. Dexter didn't ask any unnecessary questions. For $200, almost all the money Steve had, he gave him an old .38 caliber revolver and a box of ammunition. The gun was worn but functional. Steve returned to the hotel with a heavy load in his jacket pocket. He sat on the bed, holding the revolver in his hands, trying to figure out what he was going to do. Part of him screamed that it was madness, that he couldn't do it, that he would ruin everything for good. But another part, the part born of pain and humiliation, whispered that there was no other way, that Shanikva had to pay, that justice had to prevail. He spent another day watching Shanikva's house. He sat in an old car he had borrowed from a friend and watched the windows. He knew their routine by heart. Tyrone left for his evening shift at the mall at 8 o'clock. Shanikva came home from work at 6. Amara came home from school at 4. By 10 o'clock, everyone was asleep, and the lights in the windows went out. Steve watched and planned. His mind was strangely clear, cold, and frightening. He knew he was about to cross a line of no return, but that no longer frightened him. The fear was gone, leaving only determination. Evening came quickly. Steve sat in his car and watched as Tyrone left the house in his security guard uniform and got into his beat-up pickup truck. The car drove away and disappeared around the corner. Only Shanikwa and Amara remained in the house. Steve waited another hour until it was completely dark and the street was empty. He got out of the car, feeling the weight of the revolver in his pocket. He walked slowly, keeping to the shadows of the houses. His heart beat steadily, without undue haste. He approached the house and stopped at the back door, which led to the kitchen. The door was old, the lock simple. Steve took a screwdriver out of his pocket. He had thought everything through in advance, and set to work. After a few minutes, the lock gave way with a quiet click. He entered the house. It was quiet and dark inside, with only the faint light of a nightlight coming from the living room. It smelled like home, dinner, laundry detergent, ordinary life. Steve walked down the hall, trying not to make any noise. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and every sound seemed deafening in the silence. He heard voices upstairs. Shanikva was talking to someone on the phone, her voice coming from the bedroom. Steve climbed the stairs, holding on to the railing. He took out his revolver and cocked the hammer. The metallic click sounded too loud, and he froze, listening. But Shanikva's voice continued. She hadn't heard anything. He pushed open the bedroom door. Shanikva was sitting on the bed, leaning against the pillows, with the phone to her ear. She looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, but no scream came. She just stared at him, at the gun in his hand, not believing what she was seeing. "Steve," she whispered, and the phone fell from her hand onto the blanket. He didn't say a word. He just raised the revolver and fired. The bang deafened him, and his ears rang. Shanikwa fell back, her face frozen in shock. He fired again, and again. 3 shots. Shanikwa's body jerked and went limp, her head tilting to one side. A dark stain spread across the white sheets. Steve stood looking at what he had done and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, only emptiness. He heard a noise downstairs. The front door swung open. Someone ran into the house. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Tyrone appeared in the bedroom doorway, panting, his eyes wide. He saw Steve, saw the gun, saw his wife's body on the bed. Horror was written all over his face. What have you done?" he shouted and lunged forward. Steve turned and fired. Tyrone collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. He gasped for breath, blood seeping between his fingers. Steve moved closer and fired again. Tyrone stopped moving, his arm falling limply to the floor. Silence. Only the ringing in his ears and the smell of gunpowder. Steve stood between the two bodies and slowly lowered his arm with the gun. He had done it. He had killed them. He had crossed a line that could not be crossed. And now there was no turning back. He heard a sound from the next room. A quiet sob, stifled crying. Amara, his daughter. Steve slowly turned and walked down the hall. The door to the nursery was ajar, and he pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was small, with pink wallpaper and stuffed animals on the shelves. A little girl sat on the bed, curled up under the blanket. Amara, his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 6 years. She looked at him with huge, tear-filled eyes and trembled with fear. Steve stopped in the doorway. He looked at her face, so similar to Shaniqua's, at her dark hair, at her trembling lips. She was his flesh and blood. His daughter. A little girl who had just heard gunshots, who knew that her mother and stepfather were lying dead in the next room. He raised his hand with the revolver. Amara closed her eyes, pressed her hands to her chest, and whispered something. A prayer. Steve looked at her, and his hand began to tremble. He couldn't raise a weapon against his own daughter. He couldn't take her life, as he had taken her mother's. Something inside him broke completely. He lowered the revolver and stepped back. Amara opened her eyes, looking at him through her tears. Steve looked at her one last time, the only person in the world who was related to him by blood, and turned away. He left the room and went down the stairs. He left the house through the back door and disappeared into the night. The streets of Detroit were empty and dark, with only a few streetlights illuminating his path. Steve walked without knowing where he was going, without thinking about the direction. He threw the revolver into a trash can 3 blocks away. His hands were covered in blood, and he wiped them on his jacket, leaving dark stains. Reality washed over him gradually, like a cold wave. He realized what he had done. He had killed 2 people. He had left his daughter an orphan. He had destroyed her life just as his own had been destroyed. Amara was now alone, completely alone. She would be taken to an orphanage, where she would grow up without a mother, without a father, without a family. He had condemned her to the same fate he had suffered all his life. Steve stopped in the middle of the empty street, staring up at the dark sky. A pain grew in his chest. Not physical, but some other kind, deep and unbearable. He thought revenge would bring relief, that killing Shaniqua would settle the score, restore justice. But instead, he felt only emptiness and horror at what he had done. Amara, his little girl, left alone in the house with her parents' corpses. Who would now remember this night for the rest of her life? Who would see his face in her nightmares? He wanted to punish Shaniqua, but he punished the only innocent person in this story. Children's homes, foster families, a system that breaks children, turning them into embittered, lost people. He knew this from his own experience, from his childhood friends who grew up without parents. Amara would go through this, and it would be his fault. Only his. He walked the streets all night, wandering aimlessly. The city was gradually waking up. The first cars appeared, and a few pedestrians hurried to work. Steve sat on a bench in the park, watching the rising sun. He knew they would find him soon, that the police would discover the bodies, find witnesses, and track him down. A former prisoner, recently released, connected to the victims. They would figure it out quickly. But it didn't matter anymore. Steve had destroyed the last thing that connected him to the world. He had destroyed his relationship with a daughter he didn't even really know. He thought about her face, the fear in her eyes, and realized she would never forgive him. She would never want to see him again. To her, he would always be the monster who killed her parents. Somewhere on the other side of town, in a small house on a quiet street, the morning was beginning. Shaniqua's neighbor, Mrs. Holmes, went out onto the porch at 7 o'clock as usual to get the newspaper. She noticed that the back door of the Briggs house was ajar, which was strange. Shanikva was always careful and never left the door open. Mrs. Holmes walked closer, peered inside, and called out to her neighbor. There was no answer. Alarm crept into her heart, and she entered the house. She climbed the stairs, hearing quiet crying coming from one of the rooms. She looked into the bedroom and screamed. The scream echoed throughout the street. Mrs. Holmes ran out of the house, dialing 911 with trembling hands. She spoke incoherently, gasping for breath from the shock. Bodies. Blood. God, so much blood. The police cars arrived in 10 minutes. The officers rushed into the house and cordoned off the area. One of them found Amara in the nursery. The girl was sitting on the bed, hugging her knees and crying quietly. She did not respond to questions, did not answer, only stared blankly at one spot. The officer gently picked her up and carried her out of the house, covering her eyes so she wouldn't see the flashing lights of the police cars, the growing crowd of neighbors, and the arriving detectives. Amara was taken to the hospital, where doctors and psychologists tried to talk to her and bring her out of her state of shock. Meanwhile, detectives examined the crime scene, took photographs, and collected evidence. 2 bodies, several shell casings, signs of a struggle, and one surviving girl who saw everything but couldn't speak. The case of the murder of Shaniqua and Tyrone Briggs was opened on a sunny March morning. Amara Cole was left an orphan, a little girl who lost everything in one night. And somewhere on the streets of Detroit, the man who destroyed her life was wandering around, trying to avenge his own.